For those who don't know, the Harry Potter series always boasted a wide variety of different games that were released across consoles, handhelds, and personal computers. These games ranged from RPGs to puzzle games to action-adventure games. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Gamecube, however, holds a unique position in the series for being released 2 years after the original versions of the game came out alongside the movie for PlayStation 1 and PC in 2001. This version of the Philosopher's Stone is totally different to these 2001 releases and bases much of itself on a version of Chamber of Secrets that was released in 2002 for 6th generation consoles. As a result, the game is a strange novelty, so it caught my attention for its collectible value and its odd development history. I also wanted to choose an old game for the sake of exploring an old space. I find the idea of games creating unique spaces that potentially exist perpetually to be highly curious, and in the case of an old game, it can seem like a seaside vacation town that nobody visits anymore because they now fly away to more exotic locations. In the case of games, however, they are not subject to the deterioration of time in any concrete way, just the player's perception. In this way, the space in this game seemed especially off the beaten path because of its strange development and its interesting place in the broader series of Harry Potter games. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is an action-adventure game that places the majority of its emphasis on exploration, and a much smaller amount on puzzle solving, collecting, platforming, and combat, if you can even call it that. The game follows quite closely the action of the movie released a few years prior, and uses a selection of these gameplay styles to present various playable sequences that align with the events of Harry's first year in Hogwarts. Before I delve deeper, I want to address the best way to play this game because I believe the choice you make can affect the experience with the game quite a lot. Though I don't want this to be a technical dissection of the game's performance, the long and short of it is that I would recommend legal emulation of this game. With access to the original game and a PlayStation 2, I was able to capture the footage you are now watching on a fairly modern TV using component cables. In contrast, here is footage using a mid-tier upscaler. Notice the mild increase in resolution and a fairly noticeable decrease in input lag. Although I played the vast majority of the game as close as possible to the original way to play, despite not having a CRT, I now present to you the game using fairly modest resolution settings on an emulator. I didn't play much of the game this way, and so I cannot speak to the game's full performance, but I do believe this increase in resolution is such an overwhelming improvement that it would likely have had a massive impact on my enjoyment of the game for the positive, including the ability to use more modern controllers, which definitely seems to have made certain movement options far easier. Nonetheless, I will soldier on and explain to you my experience with this game, trying to account for what may have been issues unique to my chosen means of play. Having addressed the ugly, let's begin with the more positive aspects of my experience so as to ensure the review does not become too cynical too quickly. After a quick bit of exposition, the game throws you right into Diagon Alley to choose Harry's wand, the process of which acts as a tutorial for the game's gameplay systems. This brisk pace I quite enjoyed, although I can see how a particularly avid fan at the time might have found it slightly disappointing not to have seen the Dursleys or Harry's cupboard under the stairs. This pace continues throughout the game for the most part, where the story never lingers. For example, the game moves quickly from Harry choosing his wand into his first day in Hogwarts and continues much like this. Once you arrive at Hogwarts, you might immediately notice what is perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of the game, which is the day and night cycle. This deserves praise for adding extra depth to the tone and mood of the castle, thus allowing players to appreciate Hogwarts in both the shadows and the light. And it's here that I must also mention that this was probably even better appreciated with the visual upgrades that good emulation can provide. Although it's disappointing that during free roam exploration, the game doesn't push this so far as to emphasize the spookier or more mysterious elements of this old castle, I believe that might have been a stretch too far for the time. This also dovetails well with the story, so much of which involves Potter's antics at night, and the game uses a day-by-day system to progress the game, in which when Harry finishes a school day, a night section opens up, generally involving some plot-related task. A pleasant surprise you might notice is the extent to which the game lifts dialogue directly from the books. Although the downside of this is that it does make moments where the game departs from the book's dialogue to be quite jarring. This verisimilitude also applies visually to many scenes in the game too. As the game follows the predictable beats of the films, like Harry's first flying lesson, meeting Fluffy, and the troll at Halloween, you may begin to notice just how much visual action is taken directly from the films. Take for example how Neville's broom hits the castle walls in exactly the same way, how the troll damages the girls' bathroom stalls, or just how similar this scene is in the backyard of the leaky cauldron. This could be viewed cynically, but for the most part I think deserves the benefit of the doubt as aiming to provide a complimentary experience for young fans. Another point I definitely need to mention is the narration done by series veteran Stephen Fry, who was famously the main narrator for the audiobooks in the UK and Europe, and thus whose voice is quite closely linked to the Harry Potter series. Of particular note here is his work on the Folio Magi, which acts as a catalogue for the main collectible reward of the game, wizard cards. Fry's voice is used to briefly narrate certain card descriptions, which though they seem short initially, actually become quite extensive, and include lore characters that I'm certain are never mentioned in the books. This is definitely a distinct expansion of the game's lore, and it's endlessly amusing to hear Fry's voice narrate information about obscure historical figures from the Harry Potter universe. I also want to discuss the audio and sound design. What is most worth mentioning is the soundtrack, composed by Jeremy Soule, best known for his excellent compositions on the Elder Scrolls series. His work on Harry Potter is generally considered some of his best, and I have to agree with the consensus. The game shares its soundtrack with the PC version of the game. I grew up with this PC version of the Philosopher's Stone, so I was familiar with this soundtrack and still enjoy it. Although I don't want to make this a comparative analysis of the different versions of the game, I do recall the soundtrack and audio design being denser in the PC version. So for example, while you might encounter some of Soule's work in various places as you explore the castle and grounds, it is by no means a lush musical backdrop compared to PC. The game is structured into various days and nights throughout Harry's first year, and the majority of the gameplay takes place in what are called spell challenges, which are essentially dungeons designed by teachers that Harry must explore as a way of getting access to new spells, and thus new ways to combat enemies or explore previously closed off rooms and areas in the castle. Whilst these often feel like simple dungeons that could exist anywhere, in the first spell challenge, you eventually ascend a ladder, and as you emerge, you get the first hint of probably the most interesting idea of the game as it relates to exploration. When players discover a new area, the game often has a few ways of making it feel like such areas are off the beaten track. Often this is achieved by crawling through a tight space, making Harry appear in a new area that is much more expansive than it was letting on. While this isn't always the case, and sometimes you will find disappointment in opening a locked door to find only a small room with a chest, when this does work, it succeeds in making the discovery feel unique to you, but more importantly, in conveying a feeling that Hogwarts is full of secrets and surprises, and it complements instances such as these that occur in the books, particularly the idea that magic can expand or compress spaces, as seen throughout the series like Hermione's purse or Mr. Weasley's car. Speaking of lessons, player performance during these classes is graded, and depending on how many challenge shields the player collects in each lesson, a number of house points are awarded. I generally like the idea of having the player affect the house cup, even if it's a very simple way, and it can add to the Hogwarts experience. But from a gameplay perspective, specifically a Metroidvania perspective, access to certain areas to acquire more challenge shields can be a bit too on the nose to players who haven't played enough of the game to attain the spell that's needed. Although the game allows you to replay all these classes before the game ends, having a door stare you right in the face on your first playthrough, and you have an inkling that all you need to do is wait a few more lessons to access the new spell, it does make returning to some of these challenges rather hollow. Perhaps the most interesting class is Potions, which rather than directly ask you to complete a dungeon, tasks you with finding certain ingredients before the next lesson. Initially this seems quite promising and freeing, allowing Harry to collect these ingredients in a somewhat self-directed way. Eventually, however, these tasks just make Hagrid's back garden into a surprisingly large outdoor dungeon that could just have easily taken place in the Potions classroom itself, and unfortunately the only difference was that you had to make the inconvenient trip out of the castle and into the grounds. Another seemingly impressive element of the game is that after Christmas, about halfway through, Harry is granted access to his Nimbus 2000, thus allowing Harry to fly throughout the grounds and explore the castle ramparts and rooftops. Although this is initially really quite remarkable, when the novelty wears off, players will likely notice just how little this opens up in terms of areas to meaningfully explore, and the extent of what I found was a wizard card on a rooftop and an item for one of the game's few fetch quests. There was even one moment where I thought there was a secret entry to the castle on one of the rooftops, only to be disappointed, and that's not to mention how irritating it is to dismount the broom. Now that we've discussed the more commendable aspects of the game, I want to discuss some of the more irritating or disappointing. For example, the camera is often working against you during platforming sequences, and I always found the lock-on system to be extremely unwieldy. Moreover, Harry's positioning for certain prompts to appear is quite fiddly and requires a lot of patience for the throw down the hole prompt to appear, and if you're not careful, you will simply throw the gnome or imp anywhere else instead. Such things can produce a low level of frustration at the game, so if the camera does get stuck or the screen keeps blacking out like it did for me, this frustration can begin to boil over. Beyond the technical, I also want to discuss a general lack of polish. Firstly, I consider the voice acting to be very hit and miss. While many of the adult actors sound quite good, the kids' voice acting and delivery is regularly not up to par. Furthermore, many of the game's gameplay systems have aged, like platforming and stealth. There is also an antiquated gameplay language you need to adjust to. In many cases, this means that if the game has taken the time to spawn an enemy, that it must be defeated. While this works most of the time, and the game has trained you to do this, you can often be misled, finding yourself running around looking for an enemy to throw in a hole when there is in fact no hole present, and this one specific enemy was simple decoration. The game also tends to recycle its boss encounters in very rapid fashion, and this also comes across as quite hollow. A particular point I want to emphasize is the mechanic of increasing Harry's health, which is tied to how many wizard cards you collect. I was so surprised at how little fanfare there was to tell you that this had just happened and that an extra lightning bolt of health had been added to the HUD that I almost didn't realize that it was a reward for collecting the cards, and there was absolutely no explanation of it as a system at all. I would also say that Quidditch is massively disappointing. Flying through rings in a somewhat predictable pattern and having an unexplainable curse disrupt your flying, while the commentator repeatedly reminds you that you've lost control of your broom. This can be very irritating, but there is at least some interest when the game chooses to portray a rather fun scene directly from the movie. Above all, the game's big finale also feels underwhelming. It includes a predictably recycled boss fight against the Devil's Snare, an extremely short flying sequence, a somewhat bizarre rendition of chess, and a boss fight that also reuses other elements from boss encounters that you've seen multiple times throughout the game already. This isn't exactly the dramatic and interesting conclusion that I imagine many players at the time would have hoped for. To sum it all up, I can see why this game garnered a reputation somewhat cynically as a simple reskin of the PlayStation 2 version of The Chamber of Secrets, a game that was released the year prior. For anyone curious about this game, I have 3 suggestions. The first would be to keep your expectations low and understand the place it has as a collectible curiosity rather than a masterpiece. The second would be attempt to find the best way to play this game that you can, and in my experience I believe legal emulation is by far the superior option. My last would be that if you come across this review because you are curious about this part of the series, then I would suggest considering that this review alone might be enough to fulfill your curiosity, unless you are absolutely determined to play or replay this odd entry in a vast series of games.